Okay, I think we are about ready to kick off the session. Welcome to my session about mastering tenant-to-tenant migration. I hope you can see the slide deck I'm sharing right now. If not, then please speak out in the chat. First, we will kick off with the sponsor slide for the event here at the Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon. A huge thanks to the sponsors of this event. A little about me. My name is Peter Schmidt. I work as a cloud architect and consultant based out of Denmark at a company named New Consulting. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Office Apps and Services and a Microsoft Certified Master on Exchange. I run a blog on msdigest.net and is to be found on Twitter for those of you who want to follow me there. So if any question pops up and so on during the session or afterwards, you're more than welcome to reach out on Twitter afterwards or from the blog. I'd be happy to answer any questions. The agenda for my session is that we'll try and go through how we can approach tenant-to-tenant migration. Basically, it could be migration based on either merger acquisitions or some kind of consolidation of companies. I'll try and go through what is possible in the different scenarios and what we need to do during the migration and how we best plan, test, and eventually migrate the data from one tenant to another tenant in such projects. And if you have any questions along the way here, don't hesitate to pop in with questions in the chat, and I'll catch up on them in the end. So when talking about tenant-to-tenant migrations, often these are driven by the business. It could be either mergers where we see companies sort of merging, where a source tenant needs to be moved to maybe an existing tenant of a specific company, or it could be that the two companies are actually merging and have decided from the beginning that they want to eventually end up in a brand new tenant. And in those scenarios, we have basically multiple tenant-to-tenant migrations within the same projects, which makes it less complex or more complex. Then we have the acquisitions path, where I, as a company, go out and buy another company and just want to incorporate that into my existing tenant. And we have the divestitures, where we are selling basically a division or part of our company, and we need to carve out division from our existing infrastructure and tenant into the new tenant. So that's probably the scenarios that we see out there when talking about tenant-to-tenant migrations. So when talking about a migration journey, especially in those scenarios when talking about tenant-to-tenant migration, it's very important that we have the stakeholders in place in the entire organization. Because it's very hard to do a project like this if we don't have the correct stakeholders in place to get the correct backing, because a migration journey contains a lot of investment into the assessment and the planning of what is existing in our source and what do we need to move to the new target tenant. And we have a sort of a testing phase that's very important in these scenarios as well, where we involve the end user in a lot of these testings, especially that could be specific parts of the business that is very dependent on specific services. So the end user adoption in those in these migrations is very important, and it essentially is the key to success in a migration like this. So if we take a overview of the planning phase, as with all migrations, we have to start discovering and assessing what's existing, what content do we have in the source tenant that we need to move. It's not only data, it could also be overview of the users, overview of specific shared mailboxes, distribution list groups, and so on that needs to go from the source tenant into its new target tenant. And then the more detail we have on the assessment and the discovery phase, the planning phase will eventually be easier. But the planning phase is also a very important part where we can take all the steps and line them up. And along with that, depending on where you go with this, if you go into a brand new tenant or if you go into an existing tenant, you will have some kind of design phase involved in this. Because you need to make sure during the design phase, if you're going into a new source tenant, will you use a brand new domain name? Will you use existing domain names? If you go into existing target tenants, will you carry on your old domain names to the new target tenant, or eventually just inherit the domains that is already existing at the target tenant? So when all that design is in place, we have an initial design or testing phase. And the testing phase is very important because this is definitely the phase where we have a possibility of rolling back or tweaking the migration and taking care of the end user communication that needs to be in place during the migration and especially also after the migration. And what's also important that when we have the migration, that could be done in several ways, as I'll be explaining later in my session here. Sort of like we will take all in one big bang, or we can take it sequentially. And that very much depends on what kind of migration we're doing, what basically is possible doing that migration, but it also depends on the complexity of the migration. Because if we have a very large organization, it might be hard for us to do a big bang and migrate 20,000 users during a weekend, and then everyone meets up on Monday and it's rolling, logging into new laptops. That might be a more or less impossible scenario. So in those scenarios, it might be better to take it sequentially. And depending on the approach here, it also matters in terms of the migration tools that we buy in and then that can help us doing a migration like this. After the specific migration of certain users or departments, the hypercare phase is also very important because that's where we take care of our end users, and especially if we are talking about sequential migration, this is also a scenario where we get wiser doing the migration and tweak maybe the part of the migration phase. So eventually the end users see lesser and lesser problems after a migration. And something that's also important is then when everything is more or less done here, the post-migration phase is also very important because in those scenarios, we often have a cleanup phase, either in the old infrastructure or if we sort of just carved out a certain department of our company, it's also very important that we get cleaned out all the old users and all the old data that essentially lies back in the old source tenant. And potentially the post-migration and the cleanup phase can also be quite a large project in itself. So, as mentioned, it's very important that we have a good overview of the source data. So spend a lot of time doing the assessment so you know your data and your end users. And along with that, it needs to be identified in the different workloads that needs to be migrated here. So you'll have objects or users essentially that needs to be migrated in some way from the Azure Active Directory or even from the Active Directory to a new tenant or to a new Active Directory that then provisioning the new tenant. Or and you have data in Exchange Online, OneDrive for Business, SharePoint Online, and Teams, and you need to identify and assess all the data in here so you know exactly what needs to be migrated. And also if the migration is split up so that you are doing it as sequential or you are doing it sort of like department-wise, the better overview you have over that assessment and all the data divided along Exchange, OneDrive, and SharePoint, Teams, and so on, it's also easier for you to actually go in and migrate only the data needed for a specific department, or if you're doing it in a large company, maybe country-wise or other location-specific migrations. So what about other data in these scenarios? Well, in Office 365, we have other data like Yammer, and we have data that could be encrypted by information protection. We have Intune, Planner, Stream, Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automate, and so on. When talking about migration scenarios, especially tenant-to-tenant migration and data that contains within these services and workloads, right now, not a lot of third-party or migration tools at all can migrate these data. There might be some smaller chunks of each of these services that can be maybe exported and then imported back in, but you'll not find a migration tool that can actually leverage and move all the data from these specific workloads into a new tenant, not as it looks at the moment. So the data that we are looking at when talking about tenant-to-tenant migrations will be the ones that's shown on my previous slide here with Exchange, OneDrive for Business, our SharePoint data, and our Teams data. And when we talk about Teams data, it will be our files that eventually exist on SharePoint. It will be our one-to-one chats that will eventually be in our OneDrives, and then our group chats that we are able to migrate. Some of the scenarios that we see out there could be that the business scenarios, we sold a business unit and we basically moving that unit and the brand identity to a new tenant. So in those scenarios, we are moving, like in this example with Contoso, we are moving all our users as well as our Contoso domain from the source tenant to the new target tenant. And in those scenarios, we have to sort of decide during the planning if we want to do this in a big bang single event migration or if we want to do it sequentially in a phased migration. It could be also be scenarios where we look into just selling a business unit and leaving behind our old fabricant.com domain and basically picking up a rebranding where the migrated department will be contoso.com in the future. And in those scenarios, we also have to decide if we want to do it in a single event or in a phased migration. I'll come into the pros and cons a bit later on some of these. It could also be that you want to split users across two tenants, so you have basically some users still in another tenant, and moving some to a new tenant. In those scenarios, we're talking more or less like we'll see in some of the phase migration with coexistent, And the coexistence can be a hard one to manage in these migration scenarios. But some of the tools out there, the migration tools that's available on the third-party market, will actually be available to help us in the coexistence, especially if it's a large migration and we split it up in phases, and we want to keep the coexistence running for a half a year or maybe a year, depending on how large a tenant-to-tenant migration we're doing. That is possible, and also keeping that coexistence in place. So the two scenarios I'm talking about here, like the big bangs, like everything is done in a single event over the weekend, and we have all our users coming in Monday, logging into newly rolled out laptops, joining the new tenant right away, and our migration more or less done in a weekend. And we have the sequential phased migration, where we split it into phases, and that's often seen in more complex and larger migration scenarios. And it doesn't make it less complex doing it phased in those scenarios, but let's go into the pros and cons here. If we do it single event, the benefit of doing it, let's say, over weekend here, is that it eventually becomes less complex because we don't have to keep our migration infrastructure running for a longer time, and we can plan the best possible for everything to be done over maybe a few days here. It might be a lot easier on the end user training and especially on the end user understanding of what is happening in terms of still collaborating with users. Like if we do this in a single step, all our users eventually end up in a new target tenant Monday morning, and it will be easier for them to understand, still collaborating with all the colleagues. That's a bit harder if we're doing it in a phased migration, where maybe every other weekend we are migrating new users to the target tenant. That's harder for our end users to understand, why some might still be on a old source tenant and they are on a new tenant and so on. So with a single event like this, it's a minimal transition. But the disadvantage of doing this is we're doing it sort of in a big bang. So that could give us some higher risk in terms of migrating everything, because we are planning on that everything gets migrated, everyone logs in on Monday. So the disadvantage is we need to make sure that everything is available to our end users Monday morning. If we're doing it in a sequential or phased migration, we see maybe less risk in this, because if we run into some problems during the migration phase, we are not involving or hitting the problems with the 10,000 users Monday morning, but eventually it's maybe 100 or 200 users that was part of phase one that is seeing the problems, and we can do the best to actually cope with these problems, find a fix to them, and then we know the issues that we ran into during the migration phase, and then fix them for the next phase. But eventually, you also see, especially in larger environments, that there are no alternatives to the phased migration, because it will be impossible to migrate 10 or maybe 20,000 people over a weekend. That will definitely require some good planning to handle something like that. In terms of doing it phased, it can be more complex, because we need to make sure we have some coexistence in place. because this complete project could be a lot more time consuming. I've seen projects like this going on for half a year, maybe even a year, before the whole company has been migrated to new tenants. And especially if we are talking scenarios which I briefly talked about, where we see in mergers that you have several companies going into maybe a new tenant. So in those scenarios, you could have up, let's say, 2 and maybe 3 simultaneous tenant-to-tenant migration at the same time. So that will be very hard to handle in a single step, and you'll probably look into phased migrations in those. But eventually, that will become a time-consuming project, and that will also be easier to handle in a phased migration like this. Some decisions that you need to be taking into consideration when doing tenant-to-tenant migrations is, are we moving into a new environment? Is it completely new AD, maybe Azure AD tenant that we're moving into, or are we moving into a existing tenant? But there's probably some business drivers behind some of those, but it's important decision that you'll need to take before you can continue, and these will be part of the design phase. Based on those, and based on the assessment and maybe the size of the company and so on, you need to take a migration approach. So you'll need to see if you can do everything in a single step, like a big bang migration, or if you're looking into cutting over in phased migration, if you have any coexistence that needs to be running for the amount of the migration when talking about phased migration. All that is essentially based on the risk and the deadlines that the business set up. So if you take over a new company, or you need to merge, and the business says that everything needs to be running in the 1st of January, then you might have gotten some hard business deadlines to make sure that everything is running by a certain date. So when doing the migration, let's look into the different workloads that we have. So essentially, on the identity part, where we have our end users in Azure AD, or eventually from an Active Directory, you need to make sure that these users are migrated in some way to a new environment. That new environment could be eventually a new Active Directory that is located on-prem, depending on the infrastructure you're going into. It could also be a cloud-only environment that you're going into. And you need to make sure that these users will be created in the new environment. In some scenarios, these users eventually gets created from scratch. You could also have scenarios where these users are migrated using the Active Directory migration tool, where you basically inherit some of the SID history on the old users and taking that along to the new environment. But it depends on the access from the target environment and to the source environment, what's possible here. But eventually, the identity basically needs to be in place for you to be able to continue with a lot of the other workloads, especially when talking about the exchange part. So when we have the identity for our users in place, and we put on the licensing and have all that in place as well, not only do we need to make sure that the users are getting mailboxes, but as mentioned earlier, you also need to make sure now that getting the new mailboxes in the new tenant, do they need to be able to receive on the old email domain? Do the old email domain like contoso.com needs to be moved with you to the new tenant? And if it does in those scenarios, at what point do we need move them doing the migration? It very much depends on doing everything in phases and so on. But mailboxes is not the only part here, because we have some important parts on shared mailboxes. We have the Office 365 groups. We have a lot of rooms and equipment, meetings taking into consideration, and also the permissions and delegations on a lot of mailboxes. So if you have processes in place where a lot of users is working with specific permissions and delegations on a lot of mailboxes, shared mailboxes, resources, you need to have a good overview of that during the assessment to make sure that all that get applied in the new tenant as well. And a lot of this can maybe be done using the tools. Some of the migration tools out there can sort of reapply permissions from the source tenant to the new target tenant if the users that has been created or migrated earlier, they already exist within the new target tenant. So a lot of the tools out there can actually help us a lot doing the migrations of these Exchange workloads here. So another part here is the email planning. So even though that we are migrating over a weekend or maybe in a phased migration, delivery of our email is business critical and important to all of us. So you need to have a good overview of the email domains that you are moving. And in some scenarios, if you need to move the domain with you to the new tenant. So in scenarios where we need to move the contoso.com from the source tenant to the new target tenant, then it will eventually need to exist in two Office 365 tenants, which is not possible. So we need to make sure it can be removed from the source tenant before we can actually reapply it and validate it and make sure it can be useful in the new target tenant. And if we look at the email delivery part in the split where we move the domain, we could have important mails that get lost because we don't have a place to actually deliver these emails. So it's very important in a project or doing the project and in the phase of moving the domain that we have some kind of MX backup in use here. Often in these scenarios or projects where I've been involved, where we move domains like this, we put in a MX backup and point the domain to this, and then we can remove it safely from the source domain and apply it and make sure we have all the user mailboxes and we have all the user aliases in place in the new target domain. So we know that all our mailboxes can receive the emails when coming into contoso.com. And then you can release all the email from the MX backup. In terms of coexistence, so that's also very important because if we have decided to phase our migration in let's say 4 or 5 phased migration, we will eventually need to make sure that we have coexistence and mail flow in place. We'll also need to make sure we have some kind of calendar federation in place, because even though it's split into 5 phases, and we know this will take like say 2 months to do, we need to make sure that the users who has been migrated to the new target tenant can eventually look up all their colleagues who are still living in the source tenant. So we need to have configured calendar federation on both Exchange tenants to make this happen. And if we look into some of the other workloads here, we have SharePoint OneDrive, and all of those data are eventually located within sites in SharePoint. There are some good tools out there who can actually help us migrate these data to the new tenants. The most scenarios where, or the most issues seen with some of these migration would probably be if there are some very custom settings or anything done, especially on the SharePoint side. And that's also why it's important that if you have anything like that's heavily customized on the SharePoint side, you need to find the business owners for these sites and make sure they are involved in the migration of these sites. Otherwise, talking about OneDrive, that's fairly easy with a lot of the tools available out there. Then we have the Microsoft Teams. So at the moment, it's possible to migrate the Teams data, like the files, and we have the Teams chat and the one-on-one chat. So some of it will be migrated so it looks a lot like it did on the source tenant, but some chats will also be migrated so we have the data available, but it will be available in a different form, like it will look more like pictures and so on, but we get the data into the new tenant so it's available for our end users. You could also look into, as part of this, that you will need to restructure or maybe reapply some permissions in doing some of this. But a lot of the tools that I've seen out there that can help migrating is actually doing a good job on setting the permissions on the channels and the team sites out there. When talking about Teams, we also have our Teams meeting. So the meetings that's available in our end user calendars, they cannot be, well, they are migrated because we're migrating the calendar with our user mailboxes. But the meetings that has been set as online meetings to a Teams tenant, which it's now in our source tenant, will still be looking into the source tenant. So if they need to be updated to the Teams target tenant, we'll need to update those. Basically, the recommendation is that we delete them and have the users reschedule new meetings. So all the meetings will be recreated to new users and eventually replace all the existing meeting links with the new tenant meetings. I've seen some scripts out there that goes into Teams Graph and can actually do some stuff and reapply some of the schedules on these to the new tenant. I haven't tried those in production, so I can't say if they work fully, but it's definitely worth looking into because a lot of these team meetings will be the biggest hassle to our end users because they'll need to reschedule everything to make sure everything works. Also on the end user part, in terms of shared links to OneDrives, that needs to be recreated. So the links that were previously accessible will point to the source tenant, and we need to make sure it goes to the new target tenant instead. Also, if you have any external guests, that will be identified as part of the identity assessment. So if you need to get them invited into the new target tenant, you will need to make sure that is done as part of the identity creation and eventually make sure they're invited into all the new teams that will be available in the new target tenant as well. You could also have app registration or even third-party apps registered within your Azure AD. And you will have to look into those as part of the assessment, what was actually configured in our source tenant and what needs to be configured or reconfigured again in our new target tenant. And another important part of the actually migration here is the migration performance, because when moving data from a source tenant to a target tenant, eventually we often move a lot of data, and Microsoft is bandwidth throttling a lot of our tenants, which is a default configuration and basically doesn't affect the business and doesn't affect our end users. But if we want to move data like we do in a migration, we want to tweak these throttling settings. And we can apply for that within the with a support ticket in Office 365 to make sure that that throttling is not in place for specific time that we're doing the migration. As mentioned earlier, our end users is eventually the key to our success in these projects here. So not only do we need to have a good overview of where we're coming from in terms of the assessment and where we're going to, how we need to design and set up the new environment, but we also need to make sure that the end user will communicate to them what is going on here, when they will be migrated, how it will affect them, if they need to do certain tasks after the migration. So we have a good amount of guides that can help them with, especially on the things that we know will cause problems, like maybe recreating Teams meeting, recreating OneDrive links, and so on. Depending on the configuration of mobile devices, maybe something needs to be reconfigured, profiles need to be reconfigured. Are you reusing laptops? Do you just need to reconfigure Outlook? Or are you reinstalling and re-rolling the laptop so it will be eventually configured from the beginning to the new tenant? That's some of the configurations you need to take and to make sure it's prepped for the end users and also communicated to the end users. In a lot of these projects that I've been involved, there's no doubt that the end users is more happy to get a lot of good communication than rather some poor communication on what's actually going on, and they need to basically contact support the whole time to get a feeling of what's going on and get everything working for the end users here. So when we get past all that, we have migrated the end users to the new target domain. Often we look into a post-migration. It could be in the old tenant. It could be on the client side. It could also be on the licensing side, that we need to review and clean up the licenses. So as we as a company maybe has revised the licensing, and we need to clean up that part as well in both tenants. So everything is set only in the new tenant going forward. Just a brief look at some of the migration tools available out there. We have Quest on-demand migration, which, as far as I know, is able to take more or less all the workloads I talked about with Teams, OneDrive, and Exchange. We have the BitTitan migration with. They are also doing some tenant-to-tenant migration, just like Quest are. And then I know the Skykick and Code2 has some tools, and Microsoft has some tools of their own. And there is a preview on the cross-tenant mailbox migration, which is available on Microsoft Docs, which you are able to sign up to as well. When talking about these migrations here, just to highlight some warning signs, it's very important that we have a good sponsor in the company. So we have a good backing across the whole company in terms of the involvement when going out talking to the business owners here. Because talking to the business owners is part of the assessment. So if there's no time to do the data assessment, if there's no time to involve the business owners to do a risk assessment and the user engagement, and there's no clear strategy, the migration as a whole seems to be doomed from the beginning if all that is not in place. So to wrap up here, make sure you have a good assessment and content overview of what needs to be migrated. And the key to all this is planning and communicating and making sure the end user adoption is in place. It's essential to do some testing along the way, because we'll always run into some unforeseen problems along the way. And then make sure you execute on exactly what's planned and exactly what's tested. Make sure you have all the stakeholders in place, and be aware, no matter how you approach a migration, migration is always complex in some scenarios. And the more time you spend on the assessment and the planning, the less complex and the better overview you have of the complete migration as a whole. So that's my words in terms of how you can approach tenant-to-tenant migration. I know it's a lot of information to cram in on 45 minutes here, but as mentioned, migration, and especially a tenant-to-tenant migration, can easily be quite complex. So hook up with someone that is experienced as well on tenant-to-tenant migrations here. I believe we have some minutes here for some questions. The slide deck will be available. I'm not sure if the M365 Virtual Manager is sharing it, but otherwise I'll be sharing it on my GitHub. So if you follow my blog, msdigest.net, there is a link to where my scripts and GitHub resources are. And there you will be able to find my slide deck. Yes, Jonathan posted a link to my blog post, so that you will be able to find it there as well. Be sure to give some feedback, not only on my section, but the conference as a whole here. Any feedback is appreciated. If you have any questions on these migrations as a whole, you're more than welcome to reach out to me later on. I'd be happy to share my knowledge here. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the session and got some good value out of it. If there's no further questions, I'll say thanks for the time, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'll stick around for a few more minutes to answer any question that pops up in the chat. Thank you.